Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we're here to talk about the new movie Pokémon Detective Pikachu, based on, shockingly, the video game Pokémon franchise, which is in no way an attempt to pander to any listeners still left over from our Many a True Nerd guest appearance in the last episode. And then, for our follow-up question, we will be asking, how do we make better video game films? But before we delve into the murky world of the computer game movie, Alistair, what have you been doing in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I went to the Sci-Fi London Film Festival, which is London's premier festival of independent and unusual science fiction films. It's a very good festival. I highly recommend checking it out. This podcast will drop pretty much just after the season finishes for this year, so you won't be able to go if you're finding out about it now. But you can go on their website and there's good stuff, and you can go next year. Or you can look up the film I went to see, which was called Perfect.
And was it, in fact, perfect? That does seem like a bit of a self-reviewing film title.
It was flawed, I'd say that, but it was
Jesus
interesting.
Christ.
Yeah, it was not the perfect film. It's directed by Eddie Alcazar and stars, among other people, Abby Cornish, who was in Three Billboards and Sucker Punch and some other films. And it's a very, very odd sci-fi film about a teenage boy who may or may not have inadvertently killed his girlfriend and is then sent to this treatment facility to deal with whatever psychological problem that may have led to this, where he undergoes some sort of strange genetic experimentation or treatment process that basically leads to some very, very odd results. I mean, it's difficult to describe the plot of this film because I'll just say it's very strange. The way it's executed, it's shot in a fairly unconventional way. It's very interesting. I really liked it. I'd recommend seeing it with a caveat that if you like your film slightly abstract, you'll like this. If you really don't like that, you might find this a bit strange. If you enjoy, say, films like Only God Forgives or Neon Demon, which we reviewed in this podcast, or Upstream Color, sort of movies like that, you'll probably like this. Had an amazing soundtrack by Flying Lotus, who's an artist I quite like and have seen live. And it was very, very interesting, very good, but very strange.
I mean, I guess if you've got to the point of going to a sci-fi film festival, you're probably not just looking for straight down the line mainstream sci-fi.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the sort of stuff they have at the festival. Some of it is like, and there's nothing wrong with this, like indie filmmakers trying to do indie versions of big budget things. So there's plenty of sort of first contact alien movies. There's usually quite a lot of sci-fi horror ones. There's usually a smattering of superhero films. So there are some people who are, just like say indie filmmakers making things I guess they want to make, telling the stories they want to tell, even if though we've already got lots of first contact films and superhero films. But not that they can't make new good ones. But then there's also filmmakers, again, who using the fact that it's an independent medium to do something different and odd and strange, or something that may not find a mainstream audience. Which I guess is what you find at a lot of film festivals generally, that if you go to like the BFI Film Festival, lots of people are doing rom-coms or crime films, and some people are doing really weird abstract films.
Are there a lot of indie superhero films? Is that a big scene? I always assumed it was a bit like, to be honest, like it is in superhero comics, where realistically, the people who want superhero films are so well served by, Marvel and DC, basically, that they don't really care about a lot of the indie superheroes.
Yeah, I'd say that is the case. There's also the fact that obviously superheroes require a budget to make them look good, whereas like you can do a sci-fi horror, for example, usually on a lower budget. But I think also like indie superhero comics, based on my limited experience, most of the indie sci-fi superhero films are people who try to do something like a bit different, with the genre, like something that's like maybe a bit funnier or something like that. The best example is a film which is really good, and it's on Amazon Prime now, which I saw at the Sci-Fi London Film Festival a few years ago. A movie called Super Bob about a postman from South London who's struck by an asteroid and then gets superpowers. And he's basically a bit incompetent and a bit silly, but he's also kind of like a superhero. The film also has Catherine Tate in it, being very funny. But yeah, it's not your average superhero film. But I'd recommend Super Bob as well as Perfect.
Yeah, I guess that's the one way to do indie sort of low-budget superheroes, isn't it? Sort of comedy, what if a normal guy was a superhero type stuff.
Yeah.
That'd be one of the only indie superhero comics I've truly loved, of course, is Quantum and Woody, which isn't dissimilar from that.
Yeah, it's a similar sort of vibe from Quantum and Woody. What if a very very ordinary person became a superhero? And and there's a lot of him like visiting his mum in a retirement home and things like that. I don't know. It's quite a funny film.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I recommend the festival, and I recommend Perfect with the caveat that it is a very strange film. But yeah, if you like Upstream Color, which is another independent science fiction film from the man who made Primer, then it's kind of in that sort of vein.
Okay.
Anyway, Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, on the subject of things that are a bit strange, I've been revisiting former podcast subject The OA for their second season. So yes, I've watched the whole of Series 2 of The OA, and I'm now here to say it's really good. Please everyone else watch it, because it's starting to seem increasingly like streaming shows are getting culled quite aggressively in their second and third seasons, because the networks, the streaming service, whatever, just doesn't promote them after season 1. So, your favourite streaming series drops in its first series in a blaze of publicity, and then the second and third and subsequent ones just kind of trickle out with no interest at all. So yeah, if you liked The OA season 1, and we reviewed it when it came out, I think just a year and a bit ago, I think we mostly quite liked it. Yeah, I think the second season might actually be better. It's certainly more confident in its strangeness, and also actually slightly easier to follow. I don't know, the thing with the OA season 2 is, the premise of the OA is there's a woman who reappears after being missing for a few years. She used to be blind, and now she can see. And she starts to increasingly talk about near-death experiences she's had, and the fact that she was, for a while, imprisoned in a basement by an evil scientist played by Jason Isaacs, who has trapped a bunch of people who've had near-death experiences and is repeatedly killing them to try and work out how he could use their near-death experience to access other dimensions. I guess to say much more than that would be somewhat of a spoiler. There's some fun twists involving interdimensional yoga, which do continue into Season 2. They're not letting up on the yoga at all. If anything, it becomes clearer that there is definitely interdimensional travel happening. All the stuff it's dealing with is very odd, and it seems to counter that by being quite rooted in character and quite slow and meticulous, as if to, try and make sure you follow the paths of the individual characters and you care about what happens to them. So the fact that everything that's happening to them is weird shit involving people travelling through time by doing yoga, or travelling to different dimensions by doing yoga, is kind of by the by. But yeah, it's a really good show if what I've just described appeals to you at all.
I'm glad they kept the interdimensional yoga, because that was one of my favourite aspects of the first series.
Yeah, as I say, if anything, there is more interdimensional yoga in the second season.
Yeah, I really did enjoy the first series, and so yeah, I should get down to watching the second series. Jason Isaacs does such a good baddie. Is he in the second series?
Oh yeah, he's still in it to about the same degree as he was the first one. It's good. He's both quite good at being sort of sinisterly likeable. I'm sure sinisterly isn't the word, but anyway, sort of likeable in a slightly sinister way, in that he's superficially quite nice, but he also seems like he's clearly about to turn evil at any moment. So yeah, it's Jason Isaacs and Brit Marling again as the main two characters, the scientist Hap and the OA herself. And there's a new character called Kareem, played by Kingsley Ben-Adir, he's actually really good. He commands the screen as this sort of third lead quite quickly, even though he's a new character coming into this show that already had a reasonably large cast, because there's a group of people she's friends with in the present day timeline at this high school, and then there's a group of people she knew in this underground bunker they were held prisoner in. So it's already a show with a reasonably big cast, and again, a lot of them do continue into season 2. It has to be said, the one big concession I will make to this is, it does, I think, even if you watch the helpful recap provided by Netflix, it does assume you remember season 1 to quite a jarring degree. I would possibly recommend reading a slightly more detailed Wikipedia summary before attempting to watch season 2. After I watched the first couple of episodes, I did then just have to go and do that, because I was getting a bit, okay, and you are? And what happened to you again? And exactly what happened between you and you?
Yeah, it has been a while since the first series, so I suppose that would be useful, because it came out in 2017, I think. Have they maintained... the first series had a thing when each episode was like a different length, or there was a variety, like they were between like 30 minutes and like an hour and 15 minutes, which is an element of experimentation that streaming services can do. I'm surprised they don't do more of.
It's not quite as drastic, but yeah, the episode lengths vary between, I think, 40 minutes and 80 minutes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does jump back and forwards. The first couple of episodes, I think, are the longest. I mean, obviously we're currently in the middle of Game of Thrones Season 8, which is doing some similar. In fact, to be fair, Game of Thrones is just getting longer. But yeah, the OA is continuing to experiment with its episode lengths as well as its weird fucking plot.
Cool. That sounds good. I look forward to watching the second series.
Yeah, as I say, if you did watch the first series, whether on our recommendation or by coincidence, then, if nothing else, if you hadn't realised there was a second season, there is, and it's just as good, so do watch it. I think I've put across now. I would really like that season 3, please. Thank you.
So, from two slightly unusual, offbeat recommendations in the recommendations section, we're moving on to the big mainstream cinema release post-Avengers. We now live in a world that is after Endgame, and we do have to talk about something else that isn't Avengers. So, we are now about to review Pokémon Detective Pikachu. This is a live-action movie set in the Pokémon universe that involves a human teaming up with a talking Pikachu, voiced by Ryan Reynolds, to find his missing father and the Pikachu's lost memories. This is an odd concept for a film, even by Pokemon standards. This is kind of offbeat for what Pokemon usually does with its storytelling. But we went to see it recently, so we'll start by saying, Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, basically I liked it. There's something quite sort of enjoyably gleeful about it. Like, the characters are quite broad, but on the other hand, the moments where they meet the Pokemon and react to them are always quite pure, and there's something quite sugar-rushingly fun about the way things just keep happening. I mean, I think it's aimed at a slightly younger audience than a lot of the films we often review, the 12A moderate fantasy violence stuff we always talk about. You know, to use the parlance of UK film classifications, which will probably completely alienate all our American listeners, I think this is a PG rather than a 12A, he says, not having looked up what the actual classification is.
It is a PG, I remember from the title card of the film.
Yeah. So yeah, it feels slightly simpler, but to be honest, it's... I don't know, if we're going to go and see films that are flat-out kids' films, to be honest, yeah, this does have the childish glee I'd want from a kids' film. I mean, I'll stop reviewing a different film in a minute, I swear, but I saw the animated film Big Hero 6 for the first time the other week, and yeah, that had a similar sort of feeling of constant, sort of heightened, very emotional, very intense, sort of gleeful fun to it. There's the vibe of the kid looking for his lost dad and then just reacting to all these different Pokemon is... Yeah, it's very enjoyable to watch. It's not the biggest or most clever thing in the world, but the tropes, like the climb stuff, is all quite broad and cartoony. But I think that's kind of what makes it work, to be honest. It does do a good job of fitting all the silly Pokemon stuff in within the climb. Yeah, I liked it. It was fun. My life is unchanged, but it was fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. It's very cute, as Pokemon is. It is quite an adorable little film. It really brought the sort of rush of nostalgia back for me, which I really enjoyed, as I was about the right age for Pokemon when it really broke through in the UK, and the Game Boy games, the cartoon series, the trading card game, all of that was sort of a big feature of my early teens. It was kind of that and Harry Potter were the things that became really big in my the early part of my teenage years. Yeah, it kind of brought that back as well in a pleasantly warm, nostalgic way, completely unlike the Crimes of Grindelwald, which made you regret ever having heard of Harry Potter. You know, it was a good film. It was pleasantly entertaining. You know, it had some good comic set pieces, which we can go into in more detail. You know, it had the kind of sort of action crime plot line with quite a lot of jokes and silliness thrown in. If anything, this film kind of reminded me of Aquaman a bit, in that it had a serious sort of action plot, but also a fair amount of comedy. But it was very much from the school of kind of people doing stupid things, falling over, sort of walking into objects, being hit in the head comedy, rather than maybe the sort of 12A Marvel, Joss Whedon, slightly kind of more self-aware, you know, slightly more meta, sarcastic comedies. The tone really reminded me of Aquaman.
I'll cautiously say this film might actually be better than Aquaman, but yeah, I see what you mean about the tone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's definitely doing a sort of meta version of the sort of detective story, noir crime trope, but it's not really being that self-aware about it for the most part, it's just doing it.
Yeah.
As a sort of framework to hang this sort of plot on, you know. It's an excuse for them to go to different places and meet different Pokemon and, you know, talk to people and advance the plot. And yeah, there's a big set piece in the middle where they go to an underground fighting ring, which on the one hand is definitely the sort of place you would go in a like detective film, but also of course means they can do a Pokemon fight, which is very much, you know, the sort of thing you want to have at least one of in a Pokemon film, a bit where two Pokemon fight each other in a tournament setting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a nice use of the setting to do the things they need to do.
Yeah, when I saw that, I was very much like, well, you can't have a Pokemon film without a Pokemon battle, because it's interesting they've decided to make a live-action English-language Pokemon film, and they haven't done the bog-standard Pokemon plot of a kid goes out into the world to become a Pokemon master by capturing and battling Pokemon. They've decided to do something that's odd by Pokemon standards, in that this film takes place in a city where Pokemon and humans live side by side in harmony. There's no capturing and battling, which is why the battle they go to is underground, and the main character meets a talking Pikachu who wants to solve crime rather than, train and battle other Pokemon, or at least solve the mystery of his own memories. Like, it's just odd, but you kind of, after a while, you sort of buy the premise of the film, and I guess they do a really good job of getting you to buy into the premise of the film, and you're just kind of really entertained by this kid and Pikachu Deadpool walking around making silly comments.
Yeah, it is quite hard to detach the wisecracking Pikachu from Deadpool. It has to be said.
Yeah,
but obviously, as I say, it's a PG film. It's definitely a heavily censored Deadpool, but still, it's part of me would have been interested to see a version of this film which didn't have Ryan Reynolds in the part. But I guess if you're an exec in a meeting thinking we need someone to deliver slightly motor mouth wisecracks, can we get Ryan Reynolds? Then I guess if you can, then you get him.
Yeah, I guess because it's a slightly meta take in that this isn't a straight-up Pokemon movie or a straight-up detective film. It's a Pokemon detective film, which is like a whole new, slightly odd hybrid. Whereas, just in the same way that Deadpool wasn't quite a slapstick comedy, wasn't quite a superhero film, it's a kind of meta hybrid of the two. I don't know if Ryan Reynolds is the guy you go to for your slightly meta, slightly postmodern, wisecracking, film star. I can see there's a sort of thematic similarity between the two, which is really odd considering like this is a kid's Pokemon movie and Deadpool is like as a film that has quite a lot of pegging in it.
It's true. There is at no point
there is no pegging in this film.
Does Detective Pikachu get pegs by a Jigglypuff? That does not happen.
That's in my head now, isn't it? I can't. You've thought it, you can't unthink it.
I'm 100% confident that image exists on the internet somewhere. But yeah, I still think this film doesn't actually spend that much time getting meta about the crime filmness of it. Like, even Detective Pikachu's like comments are mostly just making fun of the stuff around them rather than saying, I don't know, well, I guess we better interview another suspect than have a eureka moment or something like that.
Yeah, it's not got that sort of self-awareness that, like I say, that's kind of Joss Whedon's signature awareness and playing with genre tropes. It's more straight up doing the genre, but with Pokemon.
Yeah, and I think the middle act where they sort of do the detective stuff with the two of them together is probably the best bit. When it's just the two of them and eventually the third person as well, the other human character, the sort of semi-love interest, going around together is definitely the really fun part. I think the opening section is fine, but it's slightly slow setup, and the finale, as these action films sometimes do, sort of blobs off a bit into sort of just heavy action. But yeah, the middle bit, which is most of the film obviously, is definitely the fun part. That's where the good meat is.
Yeah, well, the other character they meet, the love interest, is a young intrepid reporter, which is obviously another crime noir archetype that they had to get in there.
She's pretty good as well. I mean, she doesn't get a huge amount to do, to be fair, but she has a small character arc.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole Pokemon world thing might seem a bit of a batshit diversion at first, but it's probably a more workable basis if they want to create some sort of Pokemon movie franchise empire than if they'd gone straight to the fights, isn't it? I mean, now that you've established the existence of this Pokemon world where people and Pokemon live side by side, that just opens up them to do loads of, look, here's a Pokemon and a vaguely famous actor doing a genre stuff.
Yeah, I guess they decided they weren't going to do the traditional plot, which is, I guess, it's been done a lot of times, including in animated films of the Pokemon cartoon series. So this is not the first Pokemon movie, but yeah, I guess they were doing something different, and yeah, it leaves them open to do other things. They could do more cases from this detective. It won't surprise anyone, I'm sure, to say that they left it open for a sequel in the form of a new case. Or they could try blending other genres together. I don't know if they wanted to do a rom-com or a hospital drama with Pokemon. Why not?
Well, Dr. Psyduck. We're going to pass that up against the fact that, unlike Alistair, I'm not a Pokemon kid, and I don't really know the names of that many Pokemon. I'm just trying to remember the ones that I saw in the film now.
Well, I played Pokemon quite a lot when I was a kid, and enjoyed it, and like collected the trading cards, had the Game Boy games. I think I played the original Pokemon Blue and Pokemon Red quite a lot, and then Pokemon Yellow when it came out. I think I got as far as playing Pokemon Gold and Silver a bit, so I'm only really familiar with the first 150 Pokemon, and now they're up to, I don't know how many, because they keep adding more with more games, so there might be more than 500. So there was a lot of Pokemon I didn't recognize. They had a lot of the core, so most famous Pokemon, obviously Pikachu was there. They had a lot of Pokemon based on, the three you can choose at the beginning of the first game. So I think, Charmander, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur all got an appearance, plus various evolved forms of theirs. Like there's a Charizard at one point. Mewtwo, the big villain of the first animated Pokemon film, turns up. There's a Psyduck. The cartoon series has a long-running joke about Psyduck and how awful he is, basically. So they resurrected that joke for this film. So yeah, there's a lot of, the point I'm getting to with this is there's a lot of winks and nudges and sort of nostalgic bits for people who remember the video games. If you're someone who hasn't really engaged with Pokemon since they were a teenager, there's lots of things you'll recognize, even though there are obviously new Pokemon thrown in, or newer Pokemon thrown in, but there's lots of things you'll recognize. Like Bulbasaur was always my favorite Pokemon, and I'm glad there was a scene with a Bulbasaur in it at one point, or a scene where a Bulbasaur played a major role. So it had that gleam of nostalgia. So if you like Pokemon because you liked it as a teenager but haven't engaged with it much since, I think you'll like this film. And if you're a long-running Pokemon fan, and still really into it, I think you'll like it as well.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely been a decision to focus vaguely on Pokemon, but people might recognise even if they haven't kept up with the franchise, because obviously I haven't at all, and I still these are most of the Pokemon that I remember occasionally seeing in Smash Brothers or something.
Yeah, some of the most famous ones, like Jigglypuff, Pikachu, obviously.
Yeah, was there a Snorlax at any point? I remember Snorlax crashing across the screen and killing me in Smash Brothers repeatedly.
I think there was a Snorlax at one point.
This is Smash Brothers 64, obviously, because, again, I am not down with the video games.
Yeah, they had, they made an effort to get in the most famous Pokemon, things like that. Which is, again, it's what you want from a Pokemon movie.
But yeah, and even if you're not that bothered, I mean, I don't know. I think if you probably have no idea what a Pokemon is and just don't care, then you might find this slightly hard going. But they are all quite cute, even if you're not big into Pokemon. Yeah. The Ryan Reynolds character is quite funny. We've criticised a few action films lately for not doing a great job of the second act turn towards darkness or something, the bit where all hope seems lost. Yeah. And I did quite enjoy the way that at the end of that moment in this film, you just get a scene of Ryan Reynolds' Detective Pikachu staggering along a country lane, sadly, and possibly, I think maybe it's implied he might be drunk, but obviously they can't show him being drunk in a PG film, singing the Pokemon theme tune, which I just thought was quite funny.
Yeah, that was hilarious. It was, him mournfully singing the tune to the original cartoon series was exceptional.
Yeah, so yeah, and I've barely even seen that cartoon series, but that bit still hit for me. So yeah, it's just a very sort of fun, playful little film. It's very silly, it's very disposable, and it has enough character and emotional resonance that I think it still hits for me, a 35-year-old man. Like, I've seen children's films which I just find intolerable, but this film does have a certain sort of universal sense of fun, as long as you're vaguely down with this sort of geeky, snarky silliness.
Yeah, I think there were issues with, like, the plot, for example, didn't really hang together, so well. Like, there were a few twists, which I don't really feel the need to spoil because you might not have seen this film. But there was a few twists that I saw quite obviously coming. They weren't really much of a surprise. And there was some quite heavy-handed exposition that seemed like unnecessarily clunky. And quite a lot of the plot had one of those things that the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense, which is kind of my main plot criticism for a lot of films. It obviously had these flaws, but I don't think people were really there for the plot. I didn't expect this to be a noir detective story that was as engaging as The Maltese Falcon or something like that. That I was there for the Pokemon, for the nostalgia, for that kind of, that action meets comedy vibe that works so well for blockbuster films. So I don't think it's a huge criticism to say the plot was a bit ropey, because it certainly didn't distract really from my enjoyment of the film. But yeah, I mean, there were ways in which I think it could have been executed better. In fact, I think they could have made the plot simpler. I guess they felt that as there was a detective, they needed like a relatively complicated plot so they could have some twists, which is kind of essential for the detective subgenre. But it all seemed a bit overly complicated. I don't know, I would have maybe preferred a more straight up. There are plenty of detective films which is basically like, it's quite obvious who the villain is. It's more about how they get the evidence on him. It's usually a him, rather than ones when there's obviously a twist in revealing who's behind the crime. But yeah, maybe it'd been better if they stuck with a more straight up, less complicated plot, but it wasn't a huge issue for me.
Yeah, I can respect them for going through a ridiculously convoluted detective plot rather than something simpler, I suppose. Although yeah, the couple of twists that existed at the end were quite predictable. I don't particularly feel the need to spoil them because they're fine. A lot of the mechanics of the plot felt like they kind of started with what they wanted, which is this talking Pikachu that only the kid can hear. And then reverse engineered basically the entire story to create it.
Yeah.
Fair enough, you got to do what you got to do, and I did enjoy the talking Ryan Reynolds Pikachu, but only the kid could hear, so I'm not going to judge them too hard for that. And possibly a bit because of that, once you've clocked what's going on with that, it becomes possibly quite easy to work out what's going on. But, fair enough.
Yeah, but it didn't detract from my enjoyment too much. One thing that I did find weirdly distracting, and this isn't really the fault of the film, but it kind of did distract me quite a lot, which is that, so this film was made in London, quite obviously. At least all the bits that are set in the city where the noir plot goes down, because obviously you can't have a detective thing without like a sprawling city as your sort of backdrop. And it's filmed in London, mainly filmed in the bit of London where I work, the bit of London that I know very well. And I found this just incredibly distracting because they'd also kind of done a lot of CGI to make the square mile in London look like a Japanese city. Which is fair enough, but I just found the whole thing, like, even to the point of, like, really extending the skyline. But I just found it strange. Like, at one point, I noticed a branch of Lloyd's Bank. And it just, for a moment, just completely took me out of the fantasy. I was like, there's no Lloyd's Bank in the Pokemon universe. That's ridiculous. And various other things, like, there's a bit towards the end of the film when the main character is going to get on a train, and he has a sort of moment of indecision, but the building at the backdrop for the train station is the UBS building in the City of London. And I was just sitting there thinking, can't get a train in there. That's the bank. But it's not really the film's fault, because I guess they had to film it somewhere. And I guess we've kind of been spoiled by so many films are shot in like Chicago and Toronto, I think, are kind of a lot of go-to places. Certainly, a friend of mine from Chicago complained that they found Batman Begins really distracting because it was just so obviously Chicago, like all the time for that film. But I did find it really distracting with this kind of weirdly hybrid Japanese sci-fi-esque city of London. Just found it a bit odd.
Yeah, I don't know if it's really a viewpoint they could do much about from a production standpoint. Can we stop Alistair Ball being distracted because there's, I don't know, a Pikachu standing in front of his favourite lunch cafe?
Yeah, it was just odd. But like, it's just when like when things like Lloyd's Bank started to appear, and like the villains have their headquarters in the cheese grater building in central London, and there's like the Gherkin crops up at one point.
I mean, if I was a supervillain looking for headquarters in central London, those are the two buildings I'd go for.
Yeah, that is fair enough. That's right. I'm surprised it hasn't been done before. This isn't really a criticism of the film. I just wanted to share my confusion with people.
Those brief few moments in the middle of the film where you found yourself thinking, holy shit, is this real?
Yeah, or just like just getting a real like uncanny vibe from like knowing, that's Finsbury Circus and things like that. Whereas like there's one bit, there's a scene that there's a tube roundel in the background, but they've changed it to be a made up tube station that's got a sort of Japanese-esque name, but it's clearly a tube roundel. And I just found this incredibly distracting. I was just staring at them like, what station is that supposed to be?
No sense of the uncanny valley from the non-existent Pokemon, just from the tube signs.
No, exactly. Because it's the classic thing. There is a serious point here, I guess, which is with science fiction, probably not, to be honest, but with science fiction and fantasy, people can believe in Pokemon or starships or time travel or aliens or whatever. But an unusual everyday experience, like someone not getting sad when their dad died or whatever, when it hadn't been set up that they hated their dad or whatever, that would jar you out of a film much more than the appearance of time travel, aliens or Pokemon. I mean, it's not the film's fault. It had to be set somewhere or had to be filmed somewhere. But I'm saying, like, Pokemon didn't jar me out of the experience, but having a moment of seeing a Lloyd's Bank in the background did bring me out of the fantasy because it just seemed incongruous. Whereas Pokemon is not incongruous in a Pokemon film.
Yeah, much like the controversial Starbucks cup in Game of Thrones a couple of episodes ago.
Yeah.
To be fair, I'm not sure people were complaining about that jarring them out of the fantasy so much as they were just pointing and laughing, but
Yeah, that's because it's a particularly big mistake. So I'm sure we can...
It's a gigantic fuck up, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess we can save discussion of Starbucks Cup to the Game of Thrones episode. But to bring it all back to Pokemon, is that when I first saw they were doing this film, I did think, well, this could really go either way. This could be a complete disaster, or could be quite good. And it was good. I mean, it wasn't probably not going to make my top 5 or even maybe top 10 films of the year, but I found it enjoyable, and they pulled it off, which is, for a film with quite a madcap concept, is a real accomplishment.
Yeah, no, this is fun. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily going to guarantee my presence for the universe of other Pokemon films we'll probably now get, but yeah, this film in itself, it's a good time. Well done, Pokemon.
Next, we'll be asking, how do we make better video game films? The film video game adaptation does not have a great success record, but this film is good. We liked it. So, Nick, what do you think we can learn from it?
Well, this has been widely hailed as the best live-action video game film. by a lot of critics, which is obviously with a pretty heavy amount of caveating, which basically turns into damning with faint praise, as in most live-action video game films are pretty bad. I think, to be honest, what we can probably learn from it is making the most obvious possible adaptation with the standard blank protagonist probably won't work. I mean, I gather Detective Pikachu is actually a video game. Like, I don't think they've made this premise up from scratch for this film. It is based on a game called Detective Pikachu, which came out in 2016. So this is actually an adaptation of a video game. This isn't just an example of raw movie creativity. But on the other hand, it's still a strange choice, obviously, for the first live-action Pokemon film, because it's not the core Pokemon premise, as I believe we discussed in the previous section. I mean, I've come across this a lot in my own writing. I know we don't listen to this podcast to hear me talk about my writing, but, hear me out. I think it's a danger of when trying to come up with a story and confusing a story with a status quo, I guess, a setup for general stories. Like, I especially watch a lot of TV shows and read a lot of ongoing comics, and they all have sort of setups or status quos which are actually springboards for future stories. And I think a lot of franchise movies confuse telling an interesting story with setting up the status quo, which will later be used to tell future interesting stories, which you'll never get to tell because no one will like your film, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because games have to have a sort of a premise that's a universe. So yeah, like Pokemon is like a universe, but you have to find the story within it. And obviously there's a fairly obvious Pokemon story, which is, as we discussed, the trainer, battler, Pokemon master. But I think what they did well with this is they clearly found a story, and it's a good, simple story. Like, there's a mystery to solve, someone's gone missing, memory loss, things like that. They found a core story to hook you in there. Something I was thinking about actually going all the way back to Perfect, which we discussed at the top of this episode, that weirdly video game movie adaptations can have something in common with like really, really abstract arty films, this is an insight I got from, I've been watching a lot of documentaries recently about Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, which is a very strange film. And there's a documentary series by a YouTuber called Cinema Tyler. So this is his insight. And what he said was that 2001 works really well because it is a very strange, odd film, but at its core, there is this kind of very accessible, engaging story of some people in space trying to survive while a hostile AI tries to kill them. And all the more complicated stuff about the nature of life and matter and sort of interdimensional travel and where does intelligence come from is all kind of hung around that because there is a core story. And he says a lot of like arty films don't have that kind of core story, and I did feel like when I was watching Perfect, I felt this is interesting and unusual, but it does need a bit of a better story to be more engaging. And the same thing applies to video game adaptations, is that if you don't have that core engaging story, then you won't have a great film, and this does have like a core engaging story of like, there's a mystery to be solved.
Well, yeah, but it's quite a simplistic story, but then again also it's a kid's film, so yeah, fine.
There's nothing wrong with simple stories. Simple stories can be the most engaging.
It's the basic building blocks of everything, really. Like, have a story and have some characters. I mean, the Marvel films have done a lot to get over the problems that have blighted previous comic adaptations by going, right, primarily, these characters have to be cool and likeable. We're gonna cast the shit out of them because, we say this for the Marvel films. They've got good casting. And we're gonna, focus most of our energy in making you damn well like these characters so that you'll come back to hang out with them some more. Yeah. And to be honest, some of the Marvel films probably do slightly fall down on what you were saying about story because they, if anything, lean harder on making you want to hang out than they do on actually telling a story. But nonetheless, as long as you've got some decent combination of plot and character, you'll be fine. And a lot of video game films, the plot seems largely like setup, and the characters, I think a lot of video game main characters, if you just use the most obvious, straightforward main characters, and are kind of blank player avatars, which is obviously fine for the game, but slightly problematic when you're meant to be engaging with them in a passive way.
Yeah, like, I don't know, Gordon Freeman in Half-Life doesn't have much personality because the whole way the game is designed is that you're seeing it, you experience everything as he experiences it. There's no third person, kind of out-of-body cutscenes or anything like that. For that way, he doesn't really have much dialogue, or any dialogue. There's not a huge amount of characterization, but that's not what the kind of mechanic of the game is about. But that would mean, like, if they did make a Half-Life film, which I think would be a terrible idea, how they're going to bring personality to the character would be like the biggest question, because the audience isn't bringing their own personality the way they do in the video game.
I mean, even characters who are given a bit more credit for having actual traits or an attitude, like, I don't know, Lara Croft or Sonic the Hedgehog, they have, as I say, an attitude. They have a way they talk and a way they move, which makes them more interesting than just being some dude. But on the other hand, they're still not, deep, meaningful characters with motivations, wants and needs, unless you actually take the time to write them better. I know that more recent Lara Croft games, which I have not played, and the movie, which I have not seen, have allegedly made more effort to give her actual characterization.
I think, and obviously a lot of video games have brought in the fact that you bring your own personality to the game as like kind of a central mechanic, in that, you can, as you play the game and express your personality or the fictional personality that you're creating through the character, the game is sort of shaped to reflect that. So, for an obvious example, is like if you play Mass Effect, the character of Shepard has a personality and is obviously written, but you get to make decisions, which is bringing your own personality or the persona you want to play to the action, so you can decide, to be more of a villain or more of a hero. As you do that, the plot changes, other characters react, there's mechanics to restructure the world to express that personality more. So the character you're creating is informed by your own actions, the persona you're playing, and the writing and mechanics of the game. But just because games are a non-linear medium, it gives you so much more scope to do that. Whereas with film, the writers really got to do all of that. They've got to kind of set it all in advance, and they can't rely on the kind of game mechanics that make games like Mass Effect like engaging in that way. They have to make engaging films, and porting from one to the other, I think, is difficult, which is where things break down, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it would be silly just to have a Mass Effect film or TV series, or they haven't done like Halo TV series or things like that, because the way the game works doesn't kind of translate naturally into, obviously you could just point a camera at the video game, but that would kind of take the fun out of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, moving away from obvious franchise stuff like Sonic and Tomb Raider, I have, I know of, again, I haven't played any of them, I know of games like Mass Effect and The Last of Us, which are meant to be known for having actual characterization and actual narratives.
Yeah.
But no one ever seems to make films out of those. I don't know if that's because they'd be too expensive, or because those creators have decided they told their story and they don't need to license the film rights, or some other reason.
I played both of these games and I really like both of them. The way they're put together is, even though they the graphics are kind of photoreal or as close to photoreal as you can kind of get, at least with the technology available at the time, they're very cinematic. They bring in like lots of cutscenes and lots of constructs from cinema to tell the story that they're telling. They bring in, but the way the story unfolds is so much more interactive. It's based around interactivity. It is just fundamentally a different story. And although they can borrow concepts from cinema, like Mass Effect has so many homages to great, space adventure films, Star Wars being the obvious example, and The Last of Us owes so much to like great zombie films. But the core kind of way the story is told, I think, wouldn't translate into film.
Yeah, it just always seems a bit weird that they've break their back trying to make, I don't know, I guess it's because they want a sweet franchise, where something like The Last of Us, even if you did make a film out of it, probably isn't going to turn into some sort of 12A mega franchise and sell 1,000 action figures, is it?
No, probably not.
Whereas for that, I guess you need something like Tomb Raider or Sonic or Mario. God, I still don't know how you'd make a good film out of Mario, to be fair.
There is a film, but it's supposed to be terrible. I've not seen it. And obviously we've got a Sonic film coming this year, which, I mean, again, we haven't seen it because it's not out yet. It has been widely mocked.
I've seen the trailer. It's the main thing that's really awful about the trailer is obviously the character design, which is a combination between just silly and awkward looking and kind of nightmare fuel. Like... Sonic looks like a dude in a slightly heavily worn fursuit. It's really not great. And
it's like a man wearing a carpet.
The nice thing I can say about that movie is that
it's not out yet.
hasn't
yet been featured in the world yet.
Apart from the character design, which reportedly they are changing, it looks like a kids' film. It looks like a slightly annoying, shallow kids' film that I will happily safely ignore, if not for the fact that the character design looks ridiculous. Like, that character annoys me in the same way that a lot of very fast-talking, hey there, smart-ass, wisecracking characters in kids' films might annoy me. About a shit Deadpool aimed at kids. And, there's kids who may well go for that, but it doesn't look like it's, whether intentionally or not, going to exactly get much of that sweet adult crossover market. Like, even by Detective Pikachu standards, it just looks deeply annoying.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, I don't know how much I could really argue for a Sonic film aimed at, like, the 12A audience, because much as Sonic is the character I have the most child nostalgia for, I also cannot deny that he is a cartoon animal.
Yeah.
So... how much you could make a ponderous Marvel-esque epic about him, I don't know. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that this whole sort of pseudo-live action, realistic animation thing is really the way to go, to be honest. I kind of feel like they'd be better off just pouring a lot of money into making a really, really good cartoon. But what do I know?
Yeah, something that looked more like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, get them in.
Yeah.
Literally anything. To be honest, probably the same with Mario. I know it's tempting to make a live-action Mario film because most of the main characters are at least vaguely human, or at least the two Mario brothers and Princess Peach. But I think that might be a red herring, and you'd be better off making that a cartoon as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, kind of the pursuit of photorealism is probably not the way forward. You're always surprised by what a bit of stylization will cover up, or at least allow people to accept.
I mean, we've signed off on live-action Pokemon, so I guess there's stuff you could do, but yeah, I just feel like the whole backdrop of the Sonic world is so, and also the Mario world, is so relentlessly stupid, or at least so relentlessly
cartoonish,
pastel cartoonish, for trying to make a fake realistic version will just, I don't know. I think to make it work, you'd need to throw billions at it. I mean, to be fair, they've clearly thrown a lot of money at this Detective Pikachu film, but fortunately they haven't had to manufacture the whole world from scratch because it's set in a realistic city.
Yeah.
Even though I'm sure there is a lot of CGI on basically every frame of this film.
Yeah, but Pokemon has always been kind of basically like imagining this world, but with Pokemon in it. Whereas, I think the world of Mario or Sonic is further removed from our reality than the world of Pokemon. It's partly because Mario and Sonic are older games, and therefore the mechanics are simpler, which means the world is very different. If you accept it at its kind of the premise it poses, that there's a world that works in this way, then that world is very, very different to our world. Whereas Pokemon coming on later, maybe because the mechanics are more sophisticated, they allow us to be a more accurate simulation of our world. So this is a sort of roundabout academic way of just saying what you were saying before, which is that basically Sonic and Mario are more cartoony, and therefore live action versions of those franchises probably wouldn't work so well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, how do we make better video game films? Possibly just accept that a lot of them should probably be cartoons, maybe, instead of trying to make live action franchises. I mean, they've made a lot of films of the fighting games. I guess maybe because they're obviously more realistic and you can get, big name actors in to play the characters.
There is a terrible Street Fighter film out there as well.
And a surprising amount of Mortal Kombat adaptations as well.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a web series-y version that was meant to actually be, I don't know, good might be a strong word, but kind of all right?
I think possibly.
Yeah, I've just discovered that the next Mortal Kombat film is coming out in 2021, so, the IP keeps on rolling.
Okay, well, we'll probably review that for MFV 160 or something like that.
Let's watch the trailer first and see if it looks in any way good. Yeah, I don't know. Now we're only doing one thing a fortnight, so we can afford not to do too many random things for the sake of it. I mean, the last video game film we covered was Warcraft, and that wasn't amazing.
No, that was also a bad one. Although, one thing I think is maybe the issue is that these video game franchise adaptations are focused on the kind of biggest, most high-profile video games, which the audience comes with too many preconceptions of. So yeah, like, Warcraft, Sonic, Mario. Over Christmas, I watched the film adaptation of Rampage, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, which is, that's a perfectly good creature feature action movie. There's some giant hyenas, crocodiles, and gorillas. They fight each other. The Rock is a charismatic action star. But I don't think that's like a hugely famous video game franchise, or not as famous as, Sonic or Mario or Mass Effect. So maybe the fact that if you focus on some lower profile titles, that might help.
Yeah, as I say, I'm always surprised they haven't just stopped trying to make films out of these big fighty games and just made films out of the ones that come with pre-packaged cinematic narratives. Seems quicker. Then again, Assassin's Creed looks shit as well, so.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But yeah, I mean, Warcraft just seemed very generic. It felt like they hadn't really taken the time to give the characters much depth beyond video game cipherhood, which kind of killed the whole thing, really.
Yeah. The problem with that film is it was just so dull. I mean, that was an interesting year when there were two strong contenders for worst film of the year, Batman vs. Superman and Warcraft. And the question was like, well, Batman vs. Superman is like aggressively bad, and Warcraft is like punishingly dull. So which is, philosophical question, which is worse? Being bored or being offended? I think we settled on offended.
We both came down on the side of punishingly bad, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the year when everyone was trying to be the next Marvel, including video game franchises, which meant lots of films being created with the problem I mentioned of existing just to set up a status quo in which they could make more films.
Leaning too heavily on the origin story.
Yeah, too many origin stories, too many films with no ending. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. I hope we've given you some tips on how to make your video game film. If you'd like to hear more from us, you can go to our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com and see our past episodes, the occasional blog post, essay, other sundry material. And if you've particularly enjoyed the show, please do leave us a review on iTunes so that other people can help find the podcast.
You can also find us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, and you can find us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can find me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And yep, you can find me on Twitter at NickMB, you can find me on the web at nickbryan.com, and if you're at MCM London Comic Con, the weekend directly after this episode comes out, like literally the 3 days following the release of the episode, then you can find me at Table 205 in Comic Village and buy my comics from me. Come along, I have quite a lot of comics. I'd quite like not to have to carry them all on the tube home, including my new comic, The Catalyst, which is a brightly coloured delight hopping across genres with some art by the excellent Robert Ahmad, and comes out on the first day of the convention. So yes, if you're any interest in my wares and you're at that convention to look at the latest video game movie news, then why not also come to my table? Thank you. And meanwhile, back in Moderate Fantasy Violence land, we will be back in 2 weeks with our inevitable Game of Thrones episode. It'll be a good while after the final episode has aired, so spoilers, there will probably be some spoilers. See you then. Bye.
Bye.
Watch the OA Season 2. Do it. Do it.